Hey everyone, welcome again to Kalos Academy. We're so happy to have you as part of our program. I'm Stephen Keltz, one of the founders of Kalos. For 18 years, I've been working with college freshmen from all walks of life. For 5 of those years, specifically with first-gen and low-income students in a program that I was a part of at that time. So I know that the curriculum of Kalos Academy is going to work for you. Both the faculty-led classes, either on video like this, or in person as we'll start doing in 2021, and also the mentoring sessions that you're going to get with your near peers who are going to help you to figure out how to navigate your way through college life on a day-to-day basis successfully. In this video, we're going to start to lay some groundwork for working with our faculty by taking a look at John Locke's argument about property. Now, this isn't only because John Locke's second treatise is a book that's commonly taught in college classrooms, although it is, so some familiarity with it will give you a leg up on other students. But it's also because we're going to be able to work on a skill that I call finding a puzzle in a text. Other people call it finding a question in a text, or finding a tension or contradiction or problem in a text. No matter what you call it, in order to get beyond understanding the main point of a text, like we did in high school, and in order especially to be able to challenge the argument of a text, we have to see where its flaws or its weaknesses might be. And that's what we do when we find a puzzle or a tension or whatever you want to call it in a text, or as you'll hear some people say, when we problematize a text. By finding very specific areas of uncertainty or ambiguity within a text, we know more about what it means, but we can also question the connection of all of its ideas. Okay, so let's do this together. You might actually want to have the short reading by Locke that I assigned in front of you as we go through this lecture so that you can take a look at the passages that I'm referencing. Now, especially for those of you who did Professor Poole's early lesson on Locke, the main point of Locke's argument in this chapter isn't hard to find. He straight up announces his main point in the very first section of chapter 5. Locke begins with the premise that the earth and everything that grows on it are given by God to all in common. But if this is the case, it seems to him that it couldn't be possible that anyone could actually have property in any part of the earth. Or in other words, you can't own X or Y because the earth was actually given to us all in common, given to me too. And Locke says he sees this as a troublesome contradiction. He can't envision how people could provide for themselves the food and drink which are their evident right without having some property in them. So in section 25, he says what his main point in this chapter is. He says that he will endeavor to shew, that's really just the old English word, he means show there, endeavor to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common. Or in plain words, he's going to show how it is that I can make private property out of something that was originally given to all of us in common. Okay, fair enough. He's clearly laying out his main point. And then in the last section of the chapter, he reiterates that he's actually done exactly this by showing how people do various different things. How they first labor to pick up pieces of fruit and make them their property. Then later they labor to claim pieces of land and improve that land, making that their property. And then eventually they use money to buy property. But something else peculiar happened along the way during this three-stage process. Money, as it came about, also created inequality, Locke says. He says in section 50, the second to last section of the chapter, "It is plain that men have agreed to a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth." And he says this is true because they found a way that a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of by receiving in exchange gold and silver. Okay, so section 50 gives the final answer to the main point that section 25 had announced, and that is how people came to own private property within the things that God gave to all in common. But then another question has emerged along the way. Did Locke approve of the inequality that had resulted from this process? Maybe he was just trying to explain how it came about, not say that he approved of it normatively. People have taken positions on this. Some people have been vehement that Locke is a bad man because he explicitly approved of this inequality, while others have responded quite loudly that there's really no way that he ever could have approved of this inequality, especially because inequality comes along with poverty. How do we decide which camp we're in? We got some people on one side of the room shouting one thing, we got some people on the other side of the room shouting another. How would we pick a side? Well, we look for puzzles or tensions or contradictions or problems in the text, and we try to figure out what they mean. So for instance, consider this. In section 27, Locke says this. He's talking about how people, at very first, made property for themselves by using their labor. But he says this property was limited by a rule of sorts, that we had to leave enough and as good for others. So here's specifically what he says about that rule. Labor being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. So we can have what we labor on, at least where we leave some for others. But wait a minute, what does at least mean? If I said to you, I'll go to the movies, at least if Ricky doesn't go, I might be saying, I'll go on the condition that Ricky doesn't go. I just don't want to be with that dude. Or I could say, I'll think about loaning you $20, at least if I have it. And here I might be saying something else. I might be saying that there are other conditions implied as well. I have to have the money, but then also you have to promise to repay it and you have to be nice to me in the interim or whatever. I'll think about loaning you $20 at least if I have it, at the lowest condition, that is, if I have it. So you might actually want to pause the video right now and think about whether there might be even more meanings to that phrase, at least. It creates a puzzle in Locke's text because Locke is being very ambiguous on one very, very important point. Okay, so you've brainstormed a bit. What do you think, now that you've thought about it, that Locke means when he says, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others? Is he saying that we can keep the property that we make with our hands on the condition that we leave enough and as good for others? In other words, that would mean on the condition that there be enough, no poverty, and as good, no inequality. Everyone has as good as the rest. Or is he saying that there are other conditions under which we could also keep our property as well? For instance, even if inequality has come about and even if there's widespread poverty. So that question can be the start of a discussion with your discussion section leader. Section 27 contains this puzzle or tension or problem, which we know connects to the main question in the text, the main question that the whole chapter raises. Is Locke approving of the inequality that he has shown to have come about? The answer to this puzzle then has to lie in other passages in the text. Does Locke state anywhere other conditions under which it could be the case that I could keep my own property even if there's not much left for you? I'm going to close now by showing you how some people think that Locke is not approving of inequality because as they look at the text, he's in fact condemning any conditions that might have led to that inequality. And I'm going to show you this position in large part because Professor Poole or your discussion leader might have shown you the other position. So it's fun to engage in this sort of debate. As a scholar, you should use the text to disagree with whoever you want to disagree with. How do you do that? Just use passages from the text like I'm about to do here to prove anybody's interpretation of this wrong. Okay, so some scholars, as I said, see chapter 5 as actually more of a story of the decline of the human race rather than a story of the causes of private property and a good or approved inequality. Sure, anybody who reads the chapter has to admit that people gain a right to the property that they make, they gain a right to the property that they buy with their money, but these interpreters say that Locke is really trying to tell you that this ends up leading to vicious disputes, which are the very problems that government is brought into existence in order to solve. So for instance, at the very end of section 36, Locke says that if people had simply followed the old rules, they could still have as much of anything that they might need, or in other words, there'd be no poverty. And he says that they could do this without straightening anybody, or in other words, without constricting anybody. And then he says they could have done all this had not the invention of money introduced by consent larger possessions and a right to them. So it's not that there is no right to larger possessions, but perhaps he's saying that we've reached a state of the world where some people are straitened or constricted by those who claim more and more for themselves. Indeed, if you read section 36 again really closely, you'll see that it's full of all sorts of injury words. He keeps saying again and again, in essence, in the old days, people didn't hurt each other when they claimed property from each other. He says specifically that back then they couldn't entrench upon their neighbors. They couldn't do things that would be to the prejudice of their neighbors' interests, and that they couldn't commit injury to their neighbors. So things have changed, he could be saying, and not in a good way. He could be saying that money is in fact to blame for this. For instance, in section 46, he talks about how people in the olden days weren't hoarding up food or land, implying that maybe in the modern day, hoarding has actually started to become a problem. And in fact, in section 50, the very place where he says inequality has come about, he says that the people with unequal wealth are actually hoarding it. Perhaps they do it without hurting anyone, but it is hoarding. They have a right to it, but it is hoarding. And that's exactly what we'd say about maybe people that we saw on a TV show like hoarders. Yeah, sure, they have a right to all of that stuff that they've got stockpiled in their house, but man, somebody needs to stop them. Somebody needs to intervene. This has become disordered. It's still morally disordered, and it's still kind of detestable, even if they have a right to do it. So you've seen from this example how it is that some people use passages in Locke's text in order to answer a question or a puzzle or a tension that exists in the text. The big question is, does Locke approve of inequality? And we answer that by looking at an ambiguous phrase in section 27. People can keep their property at least where there is enough and as good for others. And then that raises for us an even more specific question. Are there other passages in the text that suggest conditions under which people could keep their property, even if inequality and poverty had come about? And as I've shown you, at least for some people, the answer is no. Inequality might come about because of money and rights, but Locke could be saying that it is still morally wrong. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts about this. I'm going to drop my email right here under this video clip so you can get in touch with me and tell me what you think. But I also want you to engage in a discussion about this with your discussion section leaders. Take particular passages of the text and puzzle through them together, trying to figure out what they mean. If you end up becoming more confused about what the text means, remember, that's actually a good thing. Puzzles, questions, tensions, that's how we get beyond simply the main point of a text into understanding what the text is really trying to do. All right? I hope I get a chance to talk with you about this. Enjoy.